Installing this kit will require you to remove the front bumper and disassemble significant parts of the front of the car. This video assumes that the installer is a qualified technician who is experienced with working on BMWs. This is not a bolt-by-bolt explanation of how to disassemble or reassemble the car. Before starting the cooler installation, please review the included parts list and confirm that you have all the listed parts. You will be installing 2 new heat exchangers as well as making some modifications to the plastic shrouds around the front of the radiator. These modifications consist of cutting off some small parts of the plastic and drilling holes for the new cooler hoses to pass through. We have found that a large stepped unibit works best for drilling the 1 to 1 1/8 holes needed for the hose fitting. Plastic cutting can be done with a small air saw or better, a sharp set of tin snips. Begin by removing the front bumper, plastic under tray, and the front half of the passenger side plastic fender liner. The first part we're going to modify is the plastic cover located on the back of the aluminum bumper. Unclip the wiring, undo the 6 bolts, and remove the plastic cover from on top of the bumper. Remove the clips, separate the bumper cover into 2 pieces. We're going to discard the upper piece and modify the lower piece. Next, we're going to modify the plastic bumper cover that we just removed by cutting the back of it off. Make a mark approximately 1 inch from this point on each end of the bumper cover. Take a straight edge, lay it between those 2 points, and make a mark. I've already made the mark here, so it's obvious. Once you've cut the piece on the line you marked before, it should look something like this. Now you want to drill 4 1/4-inch holes in approximately the middle of each of these 4 sections of the plastic. This is so we can zip tie the wiring back on, as we've removed the original wiring mounts when we modified this piece. Set this piece aside for now. We'll be reinstalling this later. In order to get access to the cooler lines that we're going to modify, we need to remove these brackets that surround the right side cooler. Once you've removed the coolant bracketry and the small brake duct that was right here, we now have access to this coolant line, which is the one we're going to modify. First, undo the clip and pull the coolant line off of the stock intercooler to drain the coolant. All right, next we're going to cut this lower hose to install our Y fitting. To do that, we're going to measure 2 inches from the end of the hose right there and put a mark. And then we'll measure 3 inches from the same point, the end of the hose. We'll put another mark. And we're going to cut this section of hose out between the 2 marks we've made. Once you have cut and removed that small section of hose, install your hose clamps and your Y fitting as shown here. You want to rotate the Y fitting up slightly so that it's coming out at a slight upward angle and parallel to this upper frame rail. Tighten your hose clamps. We'll get back to this later. There's 2 Torx bolts that hold the bottom of the radar system on. If you remove those, you will have already removed the upper bolts from this piece of plastic when you took out the bumper plastic. If you remove these 2 bolts and pop this up, you can pop this piece of plastic off here without having to drill out the rivet. And we can work with this just like it is right here without having to take it off the car. To make the modifications to this plastic surround on a non-facelift car, an early car, we need to remove this piece and this metal bracket, which also means removing the 2 bolts from the radar detector. Because we don't want to drill out the rivet on the radar detector, this piece is going to remain trapped in the car by the wiring, but that's okay. We can make the modifications with it still on the car. Once you've got this pulled up, like we showed before, you're just going to flip it over, and we want to remove this corner of this piece of plastic. And the easiest way to do that is probably with a like this, and you can just cut right along this corner like that, and you'll want to do that to both corners on the piece of plastic, and that's all we need to do to this. Next, we need to modify this lower piece of plastic here. to make room for the mount for the new intercooler. If you look under the piece of plastic, you'll see there's a bolt sticking up that holds the oil cooler on. What we want to do is hold this piece of plastic against that bolt, and we want to make a little impression with our hammer. Just gently tap on that so that you get a mark right there where the bolt is. We're going to want to drill a 1-inch hole where we've made that mark. We're going to do that on both sides of the car. In order to complete the modifications to the plastic pieces on the front of the car, we need to now remove them from the car, which means we have to remove this V-brace, remove the upper piece of plastic, and the 2 small lower pieces of plastic from the front. Once you've removed the V-brace and the 3 plastic shrouds from in front of the radiator, we're going to start by modifying the upper shroud first. This is the upper shroud from the radiator, this is the passenger side, and this is the front-facing portion of the shroud. As a reference, this is the plastic air intake duct that you would have had to unclip to get this shroud out, and it would sit normally right here in the car. So that should give you a reference for where we're talking about. Where we need to drill a hole is right here where I've marked with the pen. We're going to drill a 1-inch to 1 1/8 inch hole right in that spot. Once you've drilled your hole, it's going to look something like that. You're drilling through both plastic and rubber, so it might take a little cutting with a razor blade or some scissors to finish the hole off, as any kind of drill won't make a very good hole in this stuff. But that's what you should be looking at when you're done. Okay, now we're going to move on to the 2 small pieces of plastic that we removed from the car. These are the 2 pieces of plastic that you tapped on with a hammer earlier to make a mark from the bolt from the oil cooler mount. I've highlighted that mark here with a Sharpie so it's easier to see. At this point, you're going to drill a 1-inch to 1 1/8 inch hole at that point right there. The next thing you're going to do, moving to the middle of the piece of plastic, if you look measured straight up from this little split in the rubber, I've drawn a line, and where that line intersects the curve of the plastic right here, you're going to drill a 1-inch hole right there. You're also going to remove, if you can see it here, this little tab that I've marked, this little tab that sticks out. You want to just cut that right off. We get rid of that. Now up here at the top, we're going to make a little notch. This is going to make us a little slot for the upper intercooler mount to fit in the car. We're going to cut straight over from the bottom of this little round section where it intersects this little upper triangle, if you will, or this little shape here where it joins to the flat surface. You can see the line comes down there. We're just going to cut this completely out and remove it. Both the upper modification and the hole in the bottom get made to both the driver's side and passenger side plastic. The modifications to the center of the plastic only happen to this passenger side piece. All right, here's the piece after we've made the modifications we spoke about. Here's the hole we drilled in the bottom. It's going to be for the spindle for the lower intercooler mount. We've cut the slot out at the top, also for the intercooler mount. In the middle, when you drill that hole, you kind of get into this rubbery part of the plastic piece. It doesn't drill, and it's kind of in the way anyway. So once you've got that hole sort of made, I like to just cut this on those 2 lines that I've made there, make it easy to see. So you make kind of a little mouse hole. This is where the hose is going to go through for the new front intercooler. All right, once you have finished making the modifications to your small lower pieces of plastic, we're going to make another modification to the upper piece. We're going to clip the 2 pieces of plastic back together the way they would be in the car. And you can see right here where we cut the notch out of the small lower piece that I've marked the exact same spot where they overlap on the upper piece. So we're going to want to cut that little section out just like we cut it out on the other piece. Also on the back side, we want to cut off this little tab that's sticking out. We're going to do this on both sides of the car, and I've already done this on the other side. You can see what it's going to look like when you're done. You can have this little notch here, and the tab is going to be missing. All right, once you've finished drilling the holes for the intercooler hoses and cutting the slots for the mounts, you're ready to reinstall all this plastic back on the front of the car. For now, leave the metal V-brace off the front, and we're going to start installing the brackets for the intercooler. Once you've finished drilling the 1-inch holes in your plastic, we need to replace this stock oil cooler mount bolt, the front one, with the longer bolt that we've supplied in the kit. We're going to do this on both sides of the car. We unscrew that one, install the longer bolt, and tighten this up. This will be used to mount the oil cooler lower bracket later on in the process. Again, both sides of the car, same thing. Locate the lower mount spindle that came in your intercooler kit. Note that one side of the spindle has a machine counterbore in it. We're going to take the counterbore side, put it through the hole you drilled in the plastic earlier, and thread it onto the longer bolt you installed in the oil cooler mount earlier. Screw this down hard by hand. There's one of these on both sides of the car you need to install. Next, locate the lower intercooler mount plate. It looks just like this one here. It installs in the car on top of the two aluminum spindles that you just put in, and is bolted with the two 6x12mm bolts and fender washers also included in the kit. Once you've tightened down the lower intercooler bracket on top of your spindles, then you can refit this little front piece of plastic, pop it back under the radar detector. You can put the bolts back in the bottom of the radar detector and put the clips in the edge of that piece of plastic. Then you can take the bumper cover piece that we modified earlier by cutting and drilling holes in it and install that back in behind the bumper and fit all the screws that hold this all together. Once you've reassembled the plastic with all the bolts and things, you can then, using the holes you drilled earlier in that plastic piece, re-zip tie all your wiring behind the bumper. Can't really see it here, but it's pretty obvious. Next, locate the two intercooler assemblies and lay them on the bench the way I've shown here, as well as the intercooler connection hose. Fit the intercooler connection hose as shown to the bottom of this cooler and the upper corner of that cooler, just like that, and we'll install the coolers in the car with the hose already connected. Next, we're going to install the intercoolers on the lower bracket that you put in earlier. The intercoolers install with the hose connections facing the rear of the car and offset to the passenger side of the car. The coolers themselves poke down into these little rubber donuts with the little plastic pins on the bracket, just like that. The upper intercooler bracket is held on by the same bolts that hold the center V bracket in. First, install the bracket through the slots you cut in the plastic earlier, and then fit the rubber donuts in the bracket over the pins on the intercooler assemblies. Once it's in place, you can refit the center brace, lining up all the bolt holes, and install the hardware. Next, we're going to make the lower hose connection on the intercooler assemblies. The first thing to do is on this leading edge of this piece of aluminum, which is just in front of where we installed the lower Y connection earlier, just behind where the brake duct goes, on the top, we're going to install this piece of rubber edging that came in the kit. Next, we're going to install the lower intercooler hose. It connects to the passenger side intercooler on the lower fitting. It then runs up through this hole that we drilled in the plastic earlier, comes around the front of the car, and connects to the Y fitting that we also connected earlier. Make sure your hose clamp's installed, slide it on there, and tighten your clamp. Once you've fit the hose to the Y pipe and tightened your hose clamp and you're happy with everything, you can refit the plastic brake duct that goes in here and reinstall all the metal brackets that hold this cooler in place. And we'll move on to making the upper hose connection. In order to make our final intercooler connection, we need to get down in here to modify this factory hose. To get to that, we need to move this upper steel plate and this aluminum brace that runs along behind it. Once you've removed the upper steel plate and the aluminum brace, we're going to install the second Y fitting that came with the kit. To do that, we're going to first remove this hose that was attached to the top of the stock intercooler, unclip that, and pull it up here where you can get to it. And then we're going to measure 2 1/4 inches from the end of the hose and make a mark. We're measuring from the end of the hose here, 2 1/4 inches, and that's where we're going to cut the hose and install the fitting. Once you've cut the hose and installed the Y fitting, you want the Y fitting to end up facing forward like this. It takes a little patience and a little fiddling with the hoses to get everything lined up correctly and clip back in before you tighten the hose clamps. A little patience will go a long way. All right, the first step in installing the final intercooler connection hose is to run the end of the hose that has no fitting on it through the hole you drilled in this upper piece of plastic earlier. You will need to disconnect and remove the air intake piece shown here. Otherwise you can't get your hand in there to do it, and then clip this back on once you get the hose through. That hose will run back towards the Y fitting. Before you make the Y fitting connection, you can come over to the other side and connect the BMW style fitting to the upper outlet fitting on the driver's side intercooler that we've already installed. Connect the end of the hose you push through the hole in the plastic to the Y fitting as seen here. Tighten your hose clamp and you're ready to fill and bleed the system. To bleed the system, leave the front bumper and wheel well plastic off until after the bleeding is completed so you can check for any leaks. Filling and bleeding the system is basically a standard BMW procedure, except you need to do it several times to ensure all of the air is out of the new coolers. Connect a battery charger to the car before starting the bleed process. Start by slowly filling the intercooler reservoir with as much coolant mixture as it will take. Then, inside the car, set the heater controls to high heat and the fan controls to their lowest settings, but not off. Then, with the car off and your foot off the brake pedal, place the car in diagnostic mode by quickly tapping the start button 3 times. You should see diagnostic mode come up on the bottom of the dash, and the engine should not be running. At this point, hold the throttle pedal down to the floor for 10 to 12 seconds. This should start the bleed process. The cooler pumps will pulse on and off for several cycles with long pauses in between, and the coolant in the reservoir will drop. Keep filling the reservoir as the level drops. At the end of the bleed cycle, the pumps will run continuously for a while and then stop. This is the end of one bleed cycle. You will need to run this procedure at least 5 times until the level in the reservoir stops going down during one complete bleed cycle. Once you've finished and have no leaks, you can completely finish reassembling the car. Be sure to recheck the intercooler reservoir level after a test drive.